Welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their leaders past, present and emerging. The Understanding Boys podcast is a series of conversations exploring what it is to be a good man these days. And if you had a story that you could tell a boy of say 14 and he'd listen, what would that story be? And that's really what I'm asking our guests today. I'm Dr. Ray Swan, and we're a community of teachers and parents concerned with the education and growth of boys and young men in the modern world. This series is brought to you by Brighton Grammar, an all-boys school in Melbourne. To learn more about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. In this podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Matt Engler-Carlson. Matt is a professor of counselling and co-director of the Centre for Men and Boys at Fullerton. It's based in California. And in our chat today, we talk about a whole bunch of different things, about what led him to his work, how he understands men and masculinity, and we share some stories around that. A little bit about the profound impact that his dad had on him and how in turn he's really trying to be a great dad for his kids. And we also talk a little bit about what it is to be a good man these days. Really hope you enjoy the conversation today. It's great to have you on the show. We've had a couple of conversations along the way, Matt. And look, thanks very much for your time. I understand it's the afternoon over there. And welcome on behalf of all of us over here down in Melbourne, Australia.
Absolutely. It's a beautiful sunny day in California. And so, but I'm really glad to talk to everyone here because I just have a lot of respect for the work that you're doing on your end.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. And we'll get to a few things today, talking a bit about your work, which, we found really inspirational and starting to look at some of these ideas around taking strengths and, male strengths and as they're seen and how do we, enable our kids to really grow, whether it's through a therapeutic sense or what we're now looking at is how do we operationalize it at a school and community level. But I thought it'd be great just for people who don't know your work, just to maybe start a little bit about, the things that you do. And you've got a career, obviously, as a psychologist, and you're on a task force for the APA now looking at boys in school. It's quite a broad thing, but you've always struck me as someone who's, a real inquirer and someone who's, searching for your own meaning in life. And if it's not too personal a question, it'd be great to hear your own thoughts a bit about, coming to your vocation and to the work that you do.
Sure, absolutely. It'll probably be an ongoing theme of this conversation, but I'll bring up my dad probably often. And so my father was a psychologist, John Carlson, and he was an Adlerian psychologist. So he followed Alfred Adler, and that was kind of who he theoretically who inspired him, and he ended up being probably the most kind of prominent Adlerian at the time of his death. My dad died 4 years ago. So it's always interesting, growing up in a way when I have a father kind of in the field, and a lot of things that I do, not surprisingly, are things that he did. He was kind of an everyman in many ways. That he was a school counselor, he was a school psychologist, he was in private practice, he was a competitive athlete, he was a coach, and he was a college professor. But he always invented himself. Even growing up, my dad and my mom both said really clearly, like, when you go to college, do whatever you want to do. And but I had such early exposure to psychology that I looked at other things, but I think that it was very obvious that this is the direction I was going to go into, in the sense that I was very close to my dad. And so I think my experience is a little different in the sense that such early exposure, meaning that the people who would babysat me were prominent Adlerians, and my dad was involved in childhood guidance. And so in the 70s and 80s, the big move in education in the States was what we call developmental guidance. And you'd have school counselors who would come in and they would do what we call SEL now. All right. Mm-hmm. But SEL wasn't invented now. It was invented way, way back by Adlerians, honestly. And so, so my dad would write these curriculums and do parenting classes, and my sister and I were kind of the test subjects. So when they had stories or they had puppets they were going to put into these kits. We were the ones who were kind of like say, yeah, we like that one, but not that one. And so it was a very strange kind of environment, always growing up, in which, in a way, the types of things that would go into guidance was very normal to me. So the conversations around feelings and friendships and relationships. And when I was younger, I lived in a lot of different places. I was born in Michigan, lived in Illinois, moved to Florida and Hawaii all before the age of 5.
Wow.
And then I lived in Hawaii for 3 years before moving to Wisconsin, which is the Midwest, where I did most of my schooling. And oddly enough, my father was my school counselor. So, and he was involved in early wellness as well. So he was a marathoner and a meditator in the late 70s. And he really wrote about what is wellness. And he'd come into my classrooms when I was in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th and 5th grade and teach us meditation and teach us how to center and teach us breathing techniques and all these things that again, now we call, mindfulness and self-compassion. And for me, that was just normal.
Yeah,
like, that's
just how it worked.
Yeah, it's just honestly the water that I swam in. And so, and then we lived in a small town. And so he was essentially the town psychologist and town therapist. And so I learned a bit about dual relationships and how you navigate these types of things, in which in a town with only one therapist, everyone sees that one person, and even my friends would come up to me and say, "Oh, I saw your dad today," and he knew we had a party, but I told him you didn't go to the party, but my dad knew more about high school life than I did. So he would sometimes ask me like, "Are you sure you didn't go to that party?" And I would say, "What party? I wasn't even invited to that party." So he had kind of a pulse on kind of what's happening. And so, but I guess the point about that is that, I saw him really change and kind of follow his kind of whims and find ways to weave the things that he loved into his life. And I think that, I had exposure to psychology. I had exposure to sociology. I did a master's in health psychology, which was really that wellness kind of component. And I went and got a master's in school counseling because I realized I wanted to learn how to do counseling. I wanted to work with real people. And then I became a school counselor. So in that sense, I was a school counselor in the Bay Area in California for a few years at a small independent school. It was a public school, but it's a one school district, which nowadays is very rare here, but it was a K-8 school in which I was the first school counselor ever hired. And I had free reign to kind of do what I wanted to do, which seemed like a lot of responsibility to give to a 25-year-old.
Yeah.
But I think that what I kind of, I think I'm very lucky that I had parents who were very supportive and very encouraging. And if you know anything about Adlerian psychology, you realize that the main technique is encouragement. That encourage your kids to do well as opposed to praise. And Adler also came up with what they call a psychology of use and utility, which is we're a whole body, we have mind, body, spirit, and we look at strengths. We build upon the strengths that we kind of have. And I think that for me, again, this was kind of in the water. And then in graduate school, when I started reading parenting texts and how to teach parenting classes, I started thinking, "Oh my gosh, this is my life."
Yeah.
Actually, literally, the examples were me sometimes. And so, so I think in terms of kind of finding my career, I think becoming an educator was super important to me. I think that I think I was lucky that I had two parents who had gone to college, and the expectation was I would go to college, and I did. And oddly enough, the expectation, I don't know where it came from, was that I'd get a PhD.
Right.
I'm sure it was my dad.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say it was random because it definitely wasn't. But even then, like I think, when you work in the same profession as a parent, I think it was easy for some people to kind of say, "Oh, you guys must do a lot of things together." But my dad also had this notion. His background was Swedish, and so independence was important too. That he didn't want to essentially invade my pond. He didn't want to get in my areas. He wanted to give me the space to be free to do things I wanted to do. And then there were times in which he collaborated, but he always was very careful about keeping space. And so, and for me, finding my way into academia and kind of research, was like I knew I was interested in health and wellness. I had that component. And then that Adlerian component was always kind of there. I was always interested in healthy people. I was actually interested in mental health, not mental illness, which is what the field was mainly about. And then I had this weird experience where my early exposure in my undergrad was at UC Santa Cruz. So UC Santa Cruz in the United States is probably like the most liberal school in America in terms of, at that time, we had no grades. So no one got grades, everyone got narrative evaluations, and it was not uncommon to constantly not have class because of protests and to, find yourself. And so I was exposed to feminism at a young age and different aspects around identity and culture. And so carrying that into my grad work, I knew I was interested in gender. And then, again, I was interested in identity components. And as a white male, also came from a very privileged background, trying to put myself into places where I could listen and find ways to look at that privilege and use it in different ways. And so I'm, again, very lucky to have kind of mentors along the way who were able to work with me and to help me and encourage me to kind of explore that. And so I know this is a long answer, but even entering my doctoral work, you always have to do research, and I couldn't come up with anything because I had too many interests. And finally, my advisor said, we've been waiting for this fire to be lit. I think you need to light it yourself. Like, you come back next week and tell me something from your clinical work that you enjoy. And I came back and realized, I really seem to like working with male clients. Like, it seems like the clients I have, not only do I have a big caseload, but the guys stay. And I at that time, I didn't even know that there was a field of psychology and metamasculinity. I didn't know it existed. And I began to look into that and became interested in this notion of how is it that men find their way into help. So help seeking became an interest of mine, and it kind of took off from there. And I think that, in terms of what I do, my work, I feel very fortunate to have found lots of other scholars who believe in mentoring and growing people. Yeah, so I found myself moving into counseling, and I've been at my same institution for almost 20 years now. And so, and I do a lot of work around teaching, but honestly, it's a wellness component. So I teach a lot of self-care. I teach healthy relationships. My classes are always relational. I feel sorry for my students sometimes because our grad program is really hard emotionally, not just intellectually, but I think that I work with students who I believe are salt through the earth kind of people, lots of first-gen college students and lots of people who want to go back in their communities, and that's super, super important to me. So I find myself doing work around teaching, and I also do a lot of work right now around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, and have done that for the past 15 years in terms of looking at how do we teach to a broad range of people.
Yeah. So going back to the sense of vocation, so it's really clear. It makes so much sense now that you've sort of outlined some of those, those touch points and moments. And I just wanted to zoom in briefly, if it's okay, just about your dad. I mean, it sounds so fantastic that as someone who obviously had devoted his life to really, a form of depth psychology and, really the sort of the outworking of what's happening at an experiential level and goal orientation and these sorts of things. And then having a son who's kind of growing up in that and that he as a dad was so, from your experience, what you said was that he was very careful around, his wake. You didn't use those words, obviously, but that's what I got from it. His wake around giving you enough space and time, I guess, to kind of find your way in that. Because I think, and I'm thinking, I guess, of other dads who might be listening and thinking of their I know with my own son, I would love him to be a teacher. I just think he'd be such a good teacher. He doesn't want to be a teacher. But then I sort of in my fantasy, I'm like, okay, well, how would he and what would I? But that would then become a real challenge if that was to be the case, because then where would I be in that and how would I sort of manage my wake and, all of those things. That sounds like you really, it wasn't like you were in his shadow in a way, that it was a side-by-side kind of growth experience for you.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. And I think it's interesting because so my dad was a runner, like a big time runner, and he started in the mid 70s and went from not being fit. I mean, he was young, he had 2 young kids, and he was working hard, and he got interested in marathoning to the point where obsessive would be an understatement. But so I started running when I was 5. My sister and I were on a track club in Honolulu, running on the beach 4 times a week and running races. And and running just became a part of kind of who I was. And moving into kind of elementary years and high school years, I ran as well. And my dad's shadow was quite large because he was known as a runner, and he was a collegiate cross country coach and had won kind of national age group titles and whatnot. And so he was really well known. I definitely felt that pressure to be a runner. And part of me enjoyed it. And part of me, like oddly enough, like I had posters of runners on my wall growing up and not, basketball players or things. They're not Kiss or like rock stars. I'd like, famous runners, which now I think is kind of silly, but I was into it, but there was a point in which I realized I had other interests, and as opposed to, I'm really into cycling. And at some point when I was 14 or 15, I discovered cycling, and my dad discovered it with me, in the sense that I think he realized that if he wanted to spend time with me, he would join my pursuits too.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And so it was nice. Like he got a mountain bike too, and we would go and we did a couple races together and some rides and stuff. And even though I know he didn't love it as much as I did, but he did it. And it was a nice way to kind of looking at how it was interesting because there's some parenting moments in there too, is that like I was funny. I was driving with my daughter home from school today, and she's 12, and we were listening to music she did not want to listen to, which was songs from the 80s and 90s, like indie rock classics and stuff. And so some song came on, and I was like, oh, I went and saw this concert with my dad, And I realized that when I was a teenager, my parents bended their musical interests to mine, like not vice versa. Like, and so my dad went to kind of punk rock concerts with me, and he would buy the music and he'd listen to it. And I think that the list of shows I saw with my dad was pretty long, and even my mom, I remember like going to see David Bowie with my mom, one night, and she's like, I'll go. All right, let's go, Bob, but I think the idea that you would, again, my parents really worked to meet me where I was, as opposed to kind of having me stretch to theirs. And I think there's something about that I try to do with my kids too, is even though I may not, love the music, I'm trying to find a way to love it and understand what does my daughter like about it. Why does she like it? And then kind of having fun ways around that.
Yeah. Having that curiosity is so important. And it's interesting, as a runner, I think there's a point in every runner's life where that your karmic destiny is actually to be a cyclist, which is it's a really hard mental shift to make. I'm not sure I'm quite there myself with that. But it does give rise to an interesting, other part of your working life, which of course is in, the ethics around cycling and the ethics around, drugs and sport and those kinds of things. I know like a lot of people, I was a great fan of, particularly the Tour and all of that, and really just loved the story and mythology of some of these great heroes, climbing impossible mountains, and then flipping and, almost like riding down a razor's edge on the way down, 90, 100 kilometers an hour, 60 miles an hour, after climbing for 5 hours, just thinking the extreme, mental shifts that you have to make in that, and then just being really devastated with what came out of, all the inquiries around, drugs in sport. Are you able to share with us a little bit about your work and connection in that? It's to me, now that we've been talking, it makes complete sense, in your biography, to hear about your interest in there, but maybe for our listeners, just to share a little bit about the work you do in that space.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think that part of that growing up, like I was an athlete growing up, like, I played basketball, I played baseball, I was a runner and all those kinds of things. I could do most things okay, and, like I said, my dad was a college cross country coach. And then at one point he had an athlete who was Olympic caliber, who he coached actually in race walking of all sports. And so it takes something to coach a race walker in rural America, which is not necessarily the most common of sports you would see. But I would hear these stories like of the race walker going to international competitions, because he was a very close family friend. And so I had this exposure in some ways of kind of various sides of sports. And I didn't really think much about it, but I was a pretty avid fan of kind of Olympic type sports, and then got very interested in cycling. And like you said, the Tour, and actually it's funny, that's how I got interested in cycling, as I saw the Tour de France. I saw Greg LeMond in a time trial and I thought, this is amazing, and he was from not far from where I grew up, and, these little inspirational things that kind of in many ways change your life. And so what happened for me is that I was interested in this aspect of a fan, but always had opinions about stuff. Like, I'm an academic and intellectual, and I would kind of try to read between the lines. And I met a colleague about 12 years ago now, and this is an interesting one for vocation, realizing that, sometimes you actually can do your passion. Like, I have a colleague who is a sport philosopher.
Wow.
And I met him for the first time, and I kind of said, I didn't know you could do that. Like, I didn't think that was a job. Like, I didn't know you could be a sports philosopher. And he essentially has a kinesiology and philosophy background. He studies the ethics of doping, of drugs in sport. And so, and he's a cyclist. And so, again, these chance encounters you have sometimes with people, we would go on very long rides, and we'd start to kind of compare notes, and he would talk about his work, and I'd kind of reframe it from like a wellness perspective. And at some point we started looking at aspects in Olympic sport, primarily running and cycling, and looking at kind of, again, being interested in not necessarily what's wrong with everything, but also this idea of what's right with things. So again, we look at anti-doping issues in athletic sports. It's almost all enforcement. So how do we catch people? There's very little about how do we help people, or kind of what is actually working. And so we began to kind of look at kind of projects around how do you actually build healthy cultures within sports that, again, have real demands around the ability to achieve, and where doping is real in some ways. And so how do you, again, take a human lens to some of that? And it's a funny transformation in terms of kind of being very clearly in one camp, very clearly in, academic camp where I teach counseling and psychology. And then all of a sudden to kind of start doing cross-disciplinary research where I can take my knowledge of psychology and apply it to kinesiology, and being able to present at international conferences about just looking at things a little bit differently. And so we're continuing to do that, which is to kind of research kind of essentially looking at kind of what do healthy people do? Like, what do healthy cyclists do? And what are healthy teams like? And how do you start at the youth level and work it up so that it's a cultural kind of shift, but we're not even talking about actual prevention. If all money is on enforcement, there has to be some money on actually prevention. And so that's been a fun project. And I think the other part about it too, which is, how do you humanize things that seem difficult? In a way, like if I work in fields of masculinity and we look at things like violence or suicide or interpersonal violence, yet also understanding that everything has context. And I think when it comes to doping or drugs in sports, it's very easy to demonize the athlete without having a lot of compassion in terms of kind of what they may be going through, and also the structures that are in place that make it possible. And then, how do you help people when they get caught? Because there's a long body of research looking at athletes who get caught, who then go through horrific periods of depression, suicidalities. There are deaths by suicide. And, what's our responsibility in some ways to help people? And so, again, that's the compassion side of me kind of always coming through.
And do you notice that there's any differences in gender representation in doping in sport? Is it more a male problem, or is it pretty even?
That's such a good question. And it probably depends on the sport and the way we look at men's bodies and women's bodies in many ways. And I don't want to overspeak, but I think weight is an issue for women often in sports, particularly sports like diving and cycling and running, in which weight, having very, very low body mass, is important. And so you see doping around that. But I think it has a lot to do with the coaches around them, who work with men and women across the board. And so I think it's much easier to kind of talk about it in male settings. And I think sometimes because of revenue involved, the revenue is higher, so stakes are higher in that capacity. But I think it's what we've kind of seen is that it's not just a male thing, that it happens across kind of competitive sport.
So let's jump into masculinity. You've obviously done an enormous amount of work in that space, how it influences well-being and relationships. I'm interested if you're able to talk through, how your own sense of maleness and identity has sort of evolved over your life and then into your practice. Because I suspect, like all of us, culture, there's been some really big changes in how we think about that. And then as someone who's been an observer of life and its intricacies and layers, from your youth, how has it sort of played out in your life?
Yeah, for sure. I think that I think it's kind of impossible to be a researcher or a scholar or someone who kind of works in the field of masculinities without having obviously some type of reflection on your own sense of who you are as a man and where that came from. And, oddly for me, like I said, my first exposure to this was actually through women's studies, which is not an uncommon path for a lot of people who work in this field, and again, as a school counselor, the first groups that I did actually were for mothers and daughters. So like I felt more comfortable looking at women's lives than my own in many ways early on. And I remember at the school I worked at doing a mother-daughter group for junior high kids and their moms, and having an overwhelming response. In some ways, the premise of that was very preventative, which is like, hey, we know these things about women's lives, and we're beginning to see this, and so what if we did some preventive work when they were 12 and 13 and 14? And we had a really amazing turnout. It kind of really blew me away. And I got written up in 17 magazine, which for me was like, yeah, it's a big. But I had these questions like, oh, that's great. Now, how about for fathers and sons? And my initial response was like, well, they won't come, which was kind of a knee-jerk response. But I realized where that came from, which is this notion that, even in the school setting I worked at, in a K-8 school, I think 7% of the teachers were male. And you can imagine what they were. They were principal, PE, band, maybe math, science. Yeah. And again, the amount of contact I had with fathers at the school was minimal. And so later on, that comment, I thought about that comment a lot, because as I began to figure out how to engage fathers and sons, I thought about kind of what could I have done differently around that. I mean, I've done masculinity research with young adults and teenagers, and you ask them about masculinity, and they look at you like, what are you talking about? Because boys, even men, don't sit around and say tell me about your masculinity. We do it, right? Yeah. We do it. We don't talk about acting, it, Yeah. So I was doing it with my friends, right? I was doing my masculinity in my high school years and my elementary years and my college years without putting necessarily a name on it. But in some ways, the way that norms work is that recognizing when I was outside the norm, I can consciously look at kind of my early years and recognize that, I was interested in some sports that weren't the same as the most popular sports. I was quite small as a kid too. So I didn't have a growth spurt until late in high school. And so I was always the smallest kid on every team I was on. So, I knew what it was like to kind of get knocked around, and knew when I got knocked around that I sure as heck better not show tears, and I could understand that at some level, kind of what that was about. And yet also at the same time, recognizing that I had tears, right? That I was hurt. And recognizing, and I remember in high school, even again, when it came to dating, recognizing that, I would have girlfriends or I'd go on dates, and yet I also wanted to talk about it. And being fortunate to have primarily male friends in my life who also wanted to talk about it, which was, again, not exactly the norm that was projected around me, but I think I kind of developed a way of understanding that I could kind of cultivate friendships and we could have more intimate conversations and talk about it. And I think that's the one thing to realize, that a lot of these things look at kind of norms. Again, we may say male, female, whatnot, but humanly, we can all do these things, right? I can have good relationships regardless of my gender identity. I'm not incapable of having certain types of feelings. I just may not try them as much or use them as much because of kind of expectations. And so, I guess the thing about it is that I always had this sense that I was being sold a false bag of goods. That makes sense around my masculinity, is that I could watch pro wrestling, and I could watch action movies, and I could understand kind of the silent male kind of caricature, and also recognize that there was a sense of that's just Hollywood. It isn't really true. Yeah,
there's a whole lot sort of going on under the surface. And I wonder, was it your experience that, because what you're saying is resonating with some of my experiences around growing up, and the awkwardness about trying to have a real conversation with another man, particularly in my later, the early teen years. And then I think it was only ever enabled by, having a drink or something like that, where you could, be a little bit more authentic when you were a bit more disinhibited. But then, and even, as recently as, I think I've got a group of male friends. We all went to school together, 30 plus years ago now. And, I think we actually had our first genuine conversation ever, and not to dismiss all the laughs and gags and, silliness and all that, and acts, I think, of support. But really, actually, how are you? How's your marriage? How are you feeling? And it was at a dinner, and it was amazing. I was like, wow, this is incredible. But so it just, so I'm nearly 50, and that's probably, 35 plus years where we haven't really, we're very close in some ways, but we've never actually really spoken of anything on that inner level.
Yeah. And that's not an uncommon experience, I think, for a lot of men. And I think it often happens again as we get older and go through certain experiences, because in some ways the stakes are higher and the stakes are lower. The stakes in your life are a heck of a lot higher, but your stakes of trying to prove a certain type of model masculinity are way lower. Again, who I am at 50 is not who I was at 20. At 20, I didn't have anything, and so I had to prove myself. And now at 50, I've got a family and children. I got a mortgage. I got a job. But I've met some of these tasks in life. And so proving myself as a man is not as important. And, and it's interesting. My dad was a psychologist, and he wasn't terribly feeling oriented. Again, that Swedish component of him is really true. And I even realized that particularly when he died and at his memorial and whatnot, how in a way, how much our family kind of has this Swedish notion of individualism and whatnot. But my dad collected a lot of books, and my dad had a bookshelf that was probably 6 feet high and 6 feet long, all about sex. And so whereas my parents didn't tell me much about sex, but I clinically, I was a sexologist. I knew this stuff. And so in a way, I knew I was normal. Yeah. Because I'd read the clinical references in these books, and my friends would say things to me and I'd be like, oh, that's normal. I read this thing. And so I was very intellectual and kind of knew some of these.
And it all worked out.
Strange. Yeah. And it was funny because 20 years later, I was doing this thing with my dad, and I mentioned that oh yeah, I used to read those books. And my dad said, what? You were reading all those books? I was like, yeah, I read all those books. But there's elements around, I think, having some exposure to that, again, there's this false sense of good. And then I think, honestly, I found ways to cultivate friendships that were actually male friendships that were very intimate in that ways, in terms of being able to talk about things in my 20s. And then, obviously longevity helps a lot, having friends from a longer period of time. But I do have a group of about 7 friends, and we meet. Now we're on our 15th year. We meet every year for a weekend in Santa Cruz, and we mountain bike. And we live all over the country. And I brought a new friend into this group a couple of years ago, and he was very timid. And he after the weekend, he kind of said, that was really strange. I didn't think guys could be that way. And he wasn't sure, were people really that nice? And he was I was just, I've never had male friends who could kind of connect. Yeah. And I think there's something about, and I actually learned a lot of this from my colleague, Mark Stevens, who's someone who I write with. Mark's a psychologist. He's written also on positive masculinity and did a lot of work in the 70s around men's movement. And, Mark is amazing at cultivating friendships and making space for male friends in his life. And I think that a lot of men have a difficulty asking for permission to hang out with their male friends as they become adults. And I think that something about that is really important. But I think it's hard. But that sense of masculinity, I think I've had to, oddly enough, because I know this is a question we're going to talk about a little bit, but doing that reflection, for me is kind of what led me to kind of healthy, positive masculinities, which is when I got interested in learning about psychology and masculinity, I became voracious and read everything I could possibly get, including anything on Inner Library alone that my university was willing to get for me. And I read across disciplines, like whatever was out there, I would try to read. And I did research in this area, and I would hang out with people. And what I noticed, of course, was that most of the research was about what I would call the dark side of masculinity, which is looking at the problems of masculinity and kind of looking at kind of where men go wrong. And there was very little about what makes it better, or very little about healthy masculinity. And my sense initially was like, well, we have to identify there's a problem first before we have a solution. So I understood that component, but I also became a little dubious of some of the research I was reading, because I felt like the caricature that was being created, I had to ask myself, like, is this who I am? Like, am I represented in the research? Are the friends I have, are they represented in the research? And more I started to think, not necessarily. Like, I understand the conflicts that men go through, but if I read the research really well and I became a scholar, I would think that all men experienced masculinity in this way. And what I realized as a clinician is that if I came in and thought that my clients all had gender role conflict, for example, some of them did, and some of them thought it was amazing that there was a word for that. Mm-hmm. And other men look at me like, no, that's not me. Like, there's way more variability, of course, in all people, but lots of variability in masculinities and how we found ourselves. And I kind of had this thing kind of tugging, it's like a thread tugging in my brain for a while about thinking about this. And then I remember I had a conversation with Mark about this initially. He was actually my supervisor in my PhD program, and I got to do a men's group with him. And I traveled across the country to train with him for a year. And now he's one of my best friends. And he was without calling it strengths work, he was doing strength-based work, just naturally doing that and finding aspects of that. And then I was at another conversation with a man named Mark Caselica. We were actually working on this first draft of what ended up becoming these APA guidelines for counseling boys and men. The first meeting was in 2004. The guidelines sadly didn't get finished about 2018. So it only took 14 years to do this. But I remember actually we had our first meeting, and afterwards I was having a drink with Mark Caselica and a guy named Andy Horn. And we kind of were probing this kind of notion around, like, does this really represent all there is? Like, is all we really know about the problems of men's lives? And, is men and masculinity really the men of masculinity and mental illness? Is that it? Or is there actually mental health in here? And that's where honestly, our thought around this positive masculinity began to emerge then was, maybe there's something here, and I think for Mark, it came, for Mark Caselica, it certainly came from having a father who was very involved in his life, who in a way I would say was very noble in how he carried as a provider and cared for people. And I think for him wanting to honor that in him too, as someone who gave a lot to other people. And, where is this notion of kind of giving and kind of nurturing and kind of caregiving for other people represented in literature? And it wasn't, for the most part. And I think this corrective came thinking about, like, how are we really thinking about what it means to be healthy, what it means to be a healthy man.
And you're right. I mean, what we were just talking about this kind of absence of potentially these male intimate experiences, but that's one layer. And then there's the layer of, well, not, it's not homogeneous. There's a whole range of different experiences and maleness and male identities. But then there are these kind of cultural tropes, which are really well documented as well, which are probably, as you're saying, the dark side of masculinity. That's a huge body of writing and reflection. And I think still, as certainly as an educator, as a teacher, and, someone who works with kids myself, like, you're still very aware of the cultural and, I guess, dominant sort of narrative around that. How do kids grow up? How do boys grow up in a world of, where at the moment there's a lot of thinking around the dark side of masculinity as there needs to be. It's part of it. It's not a binary thing where it's on or off. It's there. But also, how do we step into these other modes and ways of being where we're going to enable kids to grow into healthy versions and enacted healthy masculinities. We were talking earlier, just before we started the podcast, about the knowing and being part of the framework that we've been working on, and about knowing some of these things, but then actually being able to imbibe or imbue them in our world around us, and what that might take as a lived experience, and then what sorts of things might support that. Obviously we've discussed the role of parents and caregivers, and how people, uncles, aunts, and older brothers and older sisters, and can play a role in that. But also, I guess, we talked about sport a little bit, and the sporting, acting in good ways, and those kinds of things, and having that goal and the aspiration. But also, I guess, the story and the narratives that also support that. And this is why I think schools are so important, because schools can be sites of reinventing local stories.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
Valuing local heroes or local heroines or local values that might be symbolized or ritualized in the everyday experience, of a child's life, so that they can sort of then start to make better choices about it as well.
Absolutely, and it's funny. I've always been really interested in narrative therapy, and that actually is why I got into this field. Was I saw Michael White give a talk, and I thought, I want to do that. That's actually how I decided to be. It's funny. My dad was actually giving the same talk. They were actually counseling the same client. And at the end of it, my dad said, "Oh, what do you think?" And I said, "Oh, that Michael White guy was really great." And I thought, gosh, if that's what it means to be a therapist, I want to do that. Like, I want to. And what I liked about Michael was both like this notion of, in a way, we are our narratives, right? We are the narratives around us, and the same ways that behavior conforms to social norms, right? The social norms around us, and so even like if we jump, like even with cycling, for example. The main thing I've been kind of talking about is you change the social norms of a team, because behavior conforms to social norms, right? And I think when it comes to schools too, it's the same thing, and environments and communities. If the narrative is one in which it's overly restrictive, or one in which there aren't these models or notions in terms of what does healthy look like, right? Then in the absence of that, you don't know, or you conform to a social norm, which potentially kind of goes back on dominant norms, which unfortunately for men is historically competitiveness and aggression. Again, I think every single male knows these things. Like, we know them because it's in the air that we live. It doesn't mean that's us, but in a way we're forced to know them. Like I knew when I was a kid that I wasn't supposed to cry, and I knew the consequences of that, and so at that point when I was younger, I wouldn't cry, even though I knew I was crying. Like I would choose the experiment. I would cry. And if there were tears in my eyes, of course I would say, "Oh, the sun's in my eye." Right. And my male friends would agree with me. Like, "Oh yeah, the sun's in his eye. Like, let him walk that off." Because we had a contract among us that as long as I didn't say I'm hurt or call my mom, I'm still cool.
Against shame, as
right.
well,
It's a shame
yeah.
piece. Right. And
yeah.
I think that now, understanding a bit more, there's ways in which as educators, we can kind of talk about those experiences, normalize it. And, I found that when you look at things around gender education or masculine education, or just talk about these conflicts, like, boys don't run away from them. They're actually quite interested in them because they know them so well.
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. They're happy to talk about it. The right time and place as well. I mean, it strikes me that, we're also, I guess, putting a lot of, in a funny kind of way, putting a lot of pressure on boys and teens, talking about the male piece, obviously, and understanding boys. But, we're talking about like the dominant cultural kind of preset and the stories that we, whether it's the unfeeling hero, superhero who's just, wipes out and it, all these baddies and, sort of that's somehow a good thing, but, not really doing it from a kind of moral or virtuous reason anymore. That's kind of gone out the window. But at the same time, we want our kids and our boys to be virtuous and healthy, and we're kind of expecting them to be really different to the messages they're receiving every day. Again, in a practical sense, I was involved a number of years ago in a different school, and I was, there was a situation where some boys had commented publicly, objectified some female fellow students, and completely wrong. And it had been, I guess, brought to bear, and we're kind of unpacking, in discussion with them about, do you understand, and really what we're looking at was the depiction of the feminine, more broadly. And these boys were looking at the depiction of feminine they saw every day, which was, whether it was, that we have in Australia, an awards night for, footballers and their partners. And, I think on one of the local, quite well-known newspapers down here, they have a ranking thing of the female partners. They kind of rank them out of 10. And so this is the diet that these kids are growing up with. Like, they're kind of seeing, well, we evaluate femininity and we give it a score, and that's what we were doing. And of course it's wrong. But we are asking them to kind of almost be at a level above, the local editor for the national newspaper that, is read by 1 million people every day in Melbourne.
Yeah. I think it's a lot. You're asking them to resist, essentially, to kind of resist these things that they're seeing, knowing that there's probably a consequence for doing so. And again, if you're in a group in which resisting is the norm, well, then that's easy. But not many younger boys are in groups like that, right? I mean, in which they see those kinds of things and it's fed to them a steady diet. And it's really hard to figure out kind of why it's wrong, and if it's so wrong, why is it shown all the time?
And celebrated and recognized, in the case of the awards, for the best dressed, that's something that adults are talking about. And, we've got a whole fashion, I'm not saying all fashion is based on it, it's not, but, there's a kind of an aesthetic drive that is, really impactful on women as well around, as you were saying earlier, female athletes and body weight and competition and these sorts of things. And so it sort of folds, and, it kind of frustrates me sometimes as a teacher that when this isn't part of the broader discussion, that we're not actually addressing things like this at a, I don't know whether it's at a political level or at a regulatory level, particularly around pornography. These are things that are just kind of under the surface that that our children are kind of interacting with every day without any stop cues or meaningful exit strategies, or even necessarily they're that conscious of the messages that they're receiving. I think a lot are, but I think some aren't, and that's really problematic.
I think it's a struggle too, is like a lot of these topics are taboo topics that are things people don't want to talk about. And so even as a parent, you feel that taboo of not wanting to talk about it. And then necessarily if you can't talk about it as an adult, how can you talk about it with your child? Right. And which again, on that sense, I think that's been like, you have to have a lot of courage and you kind of find ways to engage in a way that's helpful. And, but it's really difficult. Like, I think there are these taboo topics like that again, are all around us all the time, and they become like the water that we drink or we swim in, and we don't realize that there's consequences for some of that.
Yeah, for sure. So as a parent, Matt, you're an expert. Like, you must just get it right all the time. You were sharing your beautiful dad and stories around that. And, Matt, the parent, Matt, the dad, 10 out of 10, we're talking about ranking.
It's even worse when, like, I have a father who taught parenting, and my wife is a PhD school psychologist who does SEL. You got no excuses, buddy.
Yeah, let me tell you how you got no excuse, nowhere to hide. So if I was to ask your children, your son or daughter, about you, what would they say?
Oh my gosh, that's a funny question, because I have a 17-year-old son, like a 12-year-old daughter, and I would say parenting's hard. It doesn't matter if you know it or don't know it. It doesn't matter if you have a PhD or if you have nothing. The parenting's hard, and it's humbling. Yeah. It's extremely humbling. And even though I think I might know what to do, I would say in some ways, like, my son is a struggle for me at times, like, because I think that again, whether I like it or not, like, parts of me and my wife rub off on him, and I'd like to think a lot of the good parts do. But I think a lot of the parts that maybe I'm close to also do as well. So there's some competitiveness in me, and there's some, as much as I teach and talk through the world of feelings, right, I can be actually very closed off and not share my feelings that much. And so it was kind of funny. Like I actually, about a year and a half ago, I was fortunate enough to be honored at my university, and I had to give a big talk. And I talked about positive masculinity, and my family got to sit in the front row and heard the whole thing. And that was kind of cool. I think he was proud of me, and he kind of understood a bit of what I kind of did, but a bit more again. And my daughter too. I think it was kind of fun to see your parents like be honored and do something professional as opposed to, very ambiguous thing that you kind of do and as a vocation or whatever. But I think my kids both say that I'm very present and very responsive to kind of what they kind of do. But I think they continue to be frustrated, of course, right? That when things aren't done, at time or a certain way. But I do think my kids know that they can talk to me, even though may not want to. But I have two kids, like many families, in which they're almost like polar opposites.
Yeah.
And I struggled to understand that a little bit initially. Like, I have a son who was my world. Like when he was born, he was my favorite person in the world, And then when my daughter was born, I noticed a shift in him. And my dad was the one who kind of said, well, you don't know what it's like to be a firstborn. I thought, no, you're right. Like I was secondborn. My sister was 3 years older than me. And, I don't know what it's like to have my world taken away, in some ways being the center of attention forever and not having it change. And so I thought a lot about that and I noticed that my son shifted a lot in terms of kind of how he interacted and how my kids, again, occupy different spaces. Like my daughter is an empath, like so empathic. And I'm sure my son said, like, why compete with that? Like, I can't compete with that. Yeah. So I'll do this other part. Like he's super intellectual and super sharp. And, and my daughter's super sharp too, but he kind of rules this kind of intellectual kind of component now. And so, and it makes sense how the two puzzle pieces fit together. But boy, for a long time it was perplexing.
It's tough, isn't it? Yeah, and everyone I speak to about parenting, it's so uniformly true. And I think when we're younger parents, we look at the older parents and think, "Oh, wow, you just seem to. How did you know how to do that?" And how did you? When you set that boundary, you just didn't. You just didn't get upset. Like I'm always getting upset about, insert developmental stage. Like no TV after 8 or whatever the boundary is, and because it does it actually. As much as anything, it involves us reinvestigating our own relationships to things like boundaries and rules and
absolutely,
timings and like sometimes my daughter, she's quite, like agreeing. I've got two very different children, and my daughter is often, sort of the one kind of questioning, the boundary or the. And so I honestly sometimes I just don't have a good answer, and I walk off going, oh, I don't know why, like. I feel like I've got to go away and, spend a couple of hours just reformulating my whole way of life just to kind of answer this one question. But it's great, isn't it? I mean, as well, at the end of it, like it's a fantastic and enriching sort of an ongoing, I guess, interaction with life, isn't it? That parenting, it's always just drawing things out of you and you're always having to go through that. And that's the deal.
It's funny because I think that you can imagine, like with my son, like I want to talk about boy stuff and I want to talk about masculinity stuff and I want to like preload this stuff in there, and he just doesn't want to do it, of course. But I realize passively he, of course, picks it up. And, for sure, I mean, parenting is the most humbling thing in the world. And I think a couple of things that I've realized is that, and I think about this too, is that, I know, for example, that the world my father grew up in as a man is not the world I grew up in. He grew up in the 50s and 60s, and he was the son of a Swedish immigrant who was a Mason, and he was the youngest by far, had very old parents. I grew up in the 70s and 80s for the most part in different parts of the country, and it was different. And my son has grown up in California, and I know his world is very different, like in terms of, I'm very happy his world is different in terms of the flexibility I think that he can have in his life and how he lives it. And I'm often floored at his ability to connect with different people in a way that I probably couldn't have done. and so I think there's a humbling component to that, but I have tried really hard to put myself in his shoes as much as I can. And I realize that he's not me, and the hardest thing, of course, is my son looks just like me, like just like me, like he's like a mini me, but he's not a mini me. And I think that you're being very clear that he's not a mini me, and kind of figuring that out, and let him be his own boy. And I'm seeing it now, like he's 17 and he's, just blows me away with the things that he has done. And where it was someone who didn't seem terribly independent for the 15 years of his life, now was very independent in how he wants to do things. Yeah. And I guess the other thing is having that be okay.
Yeah.
Like I realized that my son is a little different. He's been social distancing for like 3 years. So COVID was no big deal for him. Like he was like, this is just, my life never changed. And having realized that that's okay too. Like, and I think my daughter is the same thing.
They do. They take such a long time to grow up, though, don't they? It was like I think it was Joseph Campbell who makes that point. What other species takes 18 plus, and in some cases it would seem, the jury's still out on whether they've actually gone through their adolescence. But we take a long time.
And you can know these things, like I can know this, like I know it. But when it's right in front of your face, not realize it. Like I know now, like, this frontal lobe is kicked in, right? Like, got it. But at the time, I was like, "What's going on with this kid?" And so it is funny. But he's a beautiful human, the way he's changing and progressing. And but I think in that sense, I would like to think that my kids say they can talk to me, and I guess importantly that they know that I'm proud of them and that I love them, and and same thing with my wife. And so I think it's important for kids to know that their parents are proud of them.
Yeah. If you had a story that you could tell a 14-year-old boy and he'd listen, what would the story be?
Oh my gosh. I know. It's funny. You told me you were going to ask me that question. And, I totally forgot about the story of it, but,
it can be advice as well.
This is the story, I would say. And it's nice because it spans 3 generations. And so it's my dad, me, and my son. But, my dad wasn't, I'm saying all these really nice things about him, and I think he was obviously fantastic, but he was tough. Like he was tough. Like he certainly believed in boundaries and drawing limits and natural and logical consequences, and so, but I remember, and that being said, like I was a pretty good kid. Like I didn't cause a lot of problems. But I remember when, I graduated from high school, my graduation gift was a very nice watch. And on the back, it said, he had a quote that said, "You are greater than the sum of your accomplishments." Mm-hmm. That always sat with me, and, that idea. And so I think my son was 12 or 13, and I know he was having a tough time with some stuff at school. And I just sent him an email, like, for whatever reason, I couldn't say it to him, or just kind of thinking like, I'm just going to send him this thing. And I told him how much I cared about him, and that essentially you're greater than the sum of your accomplishments. Like, does it matter if you got an A or B or C, or you got first or last, whatever, like you as a person, these are things I appreciate about you. And he didn't say anything about it. He never mentioned it once. But his 8th grade English teacher told me during our parent-teacher conference, he said, I've heard from Jackson that when he's having a tough day, he pulls up this email you wrote him.
Wow.
And it helps him feel good about himself. And I was like, what email? And then she said, it's this thing you said. I was like, oh, yeah. And so I think the story really is that learning that, we are greater than our accomplishments, that who we are as people and kind of who we are with our character, is, doesn't matter if you're first or last, or, it's how you play the game and how you live your life. And I think that's super critical, because I'm not, hyper competitive environments over here, in which there's so much competition in terms of how you see yourself, and, what school you're going to go to and what team you're going to be on and how you look. And, what we don't hear enough is this other piece, which is that inner self, and so I think that's the story I would kind of tell. And I guess for me as a parent, which is and find ways to continually reinforce that without saying it the same way every time. Yeah.
And what is it to be a good man these days?
Gosh, yeah, that's a good question, right? I mean, I think it's funny. I have two responses to that. One is that I noticed that when we ask that question, there's always a tendency to make it into a good human, which is we have to take the gender out of the person, the identity out of the person, and say, well, let's just talk about good humans. But the reality is we don't see each other as humans. I don't see you as a humanoid walking, or a platonic form. I see you as a man. And so again, to be a good man, I'm going to have to be part of my definition. And I guess other part of that would say, well, let's look at what the research says. What does the research say? And the research says is a healthy man is adaptable and to be humble and to build good relationships. And so I think a healthy man is, in some ways, is defined by the people around him. And again, the research suggests that if you have good people around you and you have good relationships, you're probably going to live a pretty long time. And you're probably going to be pretty darn happy, regardless of your income level or your status, is that you're probably going to be pretty happy. There's that exercise that we do sometimes in which we kind of say, what are the definitions of a good man? And what are the definitions of a good human or a good person? And when you overlap the two, there's only one or two things that match up. And I think the reality is you need to really think about what it means to be good, what it means to be healthy. And maybe the good isn't even right. Maybe the good is more, what does it mean to be a healthy man?
Maybe series 4, Matt, I'll change the question.
Exactly. Yeah.
I love it. Oh, thank you so much. So speaking, Matt, on just behalf of us, everyone here at Understanding Boys, it's a beautiful story that you've shared today. And, I think everything from, your connection to your work, the way that you, have this great body of knowledge and breadth of understanding, and then this kind of eloquent ease around how you talk about, things that, as someone who's read a little bit and I'm kind of noticing how you're putting it all together. It's so fantastic because for us as parents and teachers, we want to be able to, put these things into play and to, help our kids to, on their journey towards, flourishing and being healthy. So again, my personal thanks to you, Matt. As you know, I'm a massive fan. So again, it's great to be able to connect you to our audience, and thank you again.
Absolutely. It's totally mutual in the sense that I'm a huge fan of what you're doing at the school and your colleagues. And I think that, just even talking about this is something that I think we weren't doing 20 years ago, and the way we're talking right now means a lot. So I'm happy if I could share some funny stories or insights or just different ways of thinking about the context in which we do this.
We hope you've enjoyed this Understanding Boys podcast. Make sure you subscribe on your podcast app and please leave us a review to help grow the community. For more information about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.